think Frank Lloyd Wright said, if you live in one of his houses, it changes you. And I know that I feel that after having lived in this house. You would never predict that my father would end up being this type of artist from his background, from his earliest experiences. He grew up in Buffalo, New York, and his parents both worked in a factory. And they would, in the evenings, they would go to the tavern, and he had a couple brothers, and they were mostly sort of left to their own devices. He, in his junior year of high school, he entered a contest, or was entered into a contest, and he won one of 12 national prizes. So he won $100, which was a pretty big deal at that time for a junior in high school who had two factory workers for parents. And not only did he win the prize, but a gentleman came in and bought the painting. So that was a big deal. And the guy that bought the painting wrote him a letter and expressed that he thought my dad's work was great and that he had a career in front of him. And in addition to that, because of that show, he was awarded a scholarship to the Cleveland Institute of Art. I believe that scholarship was the Henry Keller Scholarship. Their relationship was in part forged on a mutual respect for painting, because my dad was not the only painter. My mom was at the Institute, so the portraits back here, my mother did. And my father just thought she was a wonderful painter. And when she would go out and paint, he would critique her paintings, which she wanted, and she thought he was a wonderful painter. And that respect continued their whole lives. When he was in basic training, they would sometimes ask people for volunteers for something, whatever it might be. And he would say, I would just put my hand up right away. My hand would just shoot up before they even said what they were asking for, whether it was clean out the toilets or do this, he would just volunteer. And so one day his hand went up, and it turned out that what they were asking for was a sign painter. And he went and he started painting these signs, and the officer came over midway through the day, and he was like, wow, not only are these done and they're readable and they look great and it's all cleaned up and you're doing them really fast. And so the officer recommended him for this post in Panama, and what he was doing there was painting very large murals for the military offices. And this, I think it really made a difference for him, because they were big, and he had the freedom to use the materials that he needed to use, and he had the freedom to do these broad gestures and to paint large, which I don't think he really had done prior to that. So it developed his style. There is a painting that he did when they were in Panama that it's based upon Susanna and the Elders by Tintoretto. It's one of his earliest paintings, and it comes out again in his later work. And so it's interesting to see how it went from the very earliest of work to the very end of the work. They started designing the house, I think, in around 68, and then moved in 70. And this house was very influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's style, with the big windows being open, an open floor plan. It's sort of built into the hill. That this house, living in this house, really had a big influence on how my dad painted, and I think that that's true. And you can see it in the sort of the borders that start to develop in my dad's paintings, as well as transparencies and the role of windows and the exterior and the interior sort of coming together in the paintings. This figure here is my mom, and this figure here is my dad, and this pairing shows up a few times. You'll see it repetitively, and I think it's taken me a while, but I think this man standing here, he always has his arm up like that. I think that's my dad painting. He particularly was interested in the German expressionists. Beckmann, who said he was outside of the German expressionist school, but Kirchner, Nolde, and then I think later in life there are some prints around, and he bought several books of Alachinsky. I think he was influential, Pierre Alachinsky. In his early work, he did oils, gouache. He typically painted directly onto canvas. And he did a lot of work on paper as well. But as time went by, he changed to this method of painting on large sheets of very thin, tracing paper almost. And he would lay those out on the floor and get down on the floor and paint with big strokes and paint those big pieces of paper. And then, like I said, that paper would get cut up and then glued onto canvas. And that was how he did his later work. And with that work, you got a lot of sort of transparency. He used acrylics with that. And for the black lines, he used India ink. So there was some shift from his materials. And then there are also some very clear periods where he went through. There was a time period when he did just a lot of black and white paintings. There's a time period where he would do sort of gray, range of grays and big solid shapes. There's a period early on that looks, I don't even know how to describe it, maybe Kandinsky. So you see different elements of other artists coming through his work and changes to his style and what he was doing, but there's definitely a continuation of things. There's definitely some figures, ways of using the figures that are repeated, that show up, they might show up back in his early work and then show up again sort of in the same way, where they're facing the same directions or doing the same things, like this painting back here shows up several times. And then it'll show up later, but with a different take on it, a different scheme to it. He was very careful to keep some of his work from each period. Every year that there's a painting from that year or a few paintings from that year. So he kept a good amount of the work that he did. And now we have this nice collection that spans from the very beginning of his career to the very end. And that's pretty special.